Hello, my name is Gian Hernandez. I am a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the University of Amsterdam in the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. I'm going to be giving a talk on intercultural communication and mental health, which originally was planned in the context of giving a talk at the non-governmental organization War Child Holland. So here's a brief overview. I'll provide an introduction of myself to give some context about my qualifications to talk about culture. I will describe culture as a complex phenomenon. I will apply culture to health and beyond. And then I will give a brief overview and go a little bit more in depth into certain aspects of the Mental Health for All project, a project looking at identifying barriers to access for mental health care, specifically for refugees and migrants. I will then discuss some synergies between this project and the institution War Child, as well as some takeaways that I would like for everyone watching this to come away with. And then originally in this context, there was a discussion planned, but of course, if you're watching this on our website or on YouTube, you are more than welcome to reach out if you have any questions that you would like to discuss. So a little bit about myself. I have a bachelor's in communication studies and classical music. I achieved these in San Francisco, California. I then moved to Heidelberg, Germany, and began a master's in global studies in Berlin, Germany. I moved from Berlin, Germany to Buenos Aires, Argentina, for the second semester of my master's, and for the third semester of my master's, I was in New Delhi, India. I then moved back to Berlin, Germany, where I wrote my master's as a report for the non-governmental organization, the Kreuzberger Kinderstiftung, which translates to the Kreuzberg Children's Organization. The report itself was on marginalized high school students studying abroad. I then did my PhD in intercultural communication, where the dissertation topic was race and nationality and international student migration in Lugano, Switzerland, at the Università della Svizzera Italiana, USI. I also did a research stay at the University of British Columbia, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, and now I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Amsterdam. That's a little bit about myself. So let's talk about culture. Culture is one of, if not the most complicated word in the English language. And the way that I'm talking about it today means that there are two main meanings. So we have one, a process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development, which implies that there is a more and less developed culture, which also implies a sort of dichotomy between what's known as high culture, namely theater, art, music, opera, ballet, that sort of thing, and low culture, things like in the internet, sort of Instagram, comic books, etc. Now, a second way of talking about culture is culture as a particular way of life. And this way of talking about culture is how I'm going to be discussing culture in the subsequent slides. Culture as a particular way of life really means that we remain open to understanding a little bit more about the sort of complicated nuances of what constitutes culture. So let me explain. We're all familiar with this image of the world. We have clearly designated nation-state boundaries. So for example, you can see Canada in orange, Australia in yellow, Russia in purple. And this is something that we often talk about when talking about cultures. We talk about Brazilian culture, Indian culture, really cultures that are associated and contained in national boundaries. However, when we talk about culture, it doesn't often match with what's actually happening on the ground, right? So if we think about a national border, do cultures necessarily stop at that border? Is it so that, for example, on the French side of the German-French border, everyone behaves in one way and thinks one way, and everyone on the German side thinks another way? Obviously not. There's very much cultural mixing, cultural fusion, etc. So another way to think about culture is like this. And this is an example in which culture is represented as color and kind of flowing across, right? We can also see that there is a predominant sort of a color that moves more sort of readily. You can see here that it's this yellowish tone is kind of, where North America fittingly was in the previous image. So you can see that yellow kind of moves across these boundaries, right? And this way of talking about culture has a very complicated implication. And I'll discuss some of those implications now. So this notion of culture critiques the nation-state bounded idea of identity. So as I mentioned before, we have this notion that identities are equal to the nation-state. So for example, I am an American, I am a Dutch person, etc. But if we think about culture as a particular way of life that can flow across boundaries, this questions that notion of identity bounded to the nation-state. It also questions the self-other relationship, in other words, us versus them. Now, self-other, this distinction comes from a sort of psychoanalytical process in which we identify ourselves vis-a-vis another person, right? And I very purposefully in this presentation capitalized self and other because it's not so that, for example, I am myself and everyone listening to this presentation is an other in sort of non-capitalized terms, lowercase terms, but rather that the other and the self become stand-ins for a sort of collective identity and then something that can be defined against that collective identity. So we have a collective notion of the self, whatever that may be, Americans, Christians, Muslims, Chinese people, whatever the self is for a collective, and then a culturally significant other, right? So we have this distinction between the us, whoever the us is, and the them, right? And if we think about this notion of culture as transgressing boundaries, we can then question those relationships. What do those relationships actually mean when the boundaries are a little bit more fluid? And then finally, it pays attention to power relations in dialogue, right? So this question of which colors prevail in the image above, we can kind of see that, for example, the yellow is a little bit more prevalent, right? The yellowish tones. And this really maps out quite well in terms of the metaphor. We can pay attention to who has power, who can determine discourses, who can sort of influence ideologies. And really this notion of culture as a way of life pays attention to those power relations. So culture as a way of life was created historically, meaning that one must always take history into account when thinking of the way cultures have been constructed. We learn culture, for example, through socialization, through education, through museums. The way museums construct the past, present, and history is a fascinating endeavor. And so we have to think about culture as created by institutions, for example, educational institutions that have a particular slant or a particular view of what cultural life looks like today. Culture as a way of life provides direction for how to live and how to make sense of life, right? So culture guides us. Culture allows us to make sense of how we move through the world. And this is very important, right? Because as a communication scholar, for myself, this notion of making sense of life entails meaning. And we have to understand that meaning making is an integral part of what values go into how we make decisions about how to live life. So this notion that culture provides direction is an integral part of thinking about how we move forward and what guides us, what ideologies, what values, what customs, etc. However, this point is very important. Culture shapes our behavior. It is very much influential on our behavior, but it does not determine it. It is not a 100% determinant factor. So for example, the statement, I am a Dutch person, therefore I behave in XYZ ways, doesn't necessarily hold up when we think of culture as a way of life. Because, of course, being born in a specific place and being socialized in a specific context, experiencing institutions in a specific way, very much shapes our behavior, can constrain our behavior, but it does not one-to-one determine it. And I think this is very important because people often rely on these sorts of statements in an essentialist way to say, this is who I am, this is my essence, and this is therefore how I behave. And it allows us not to necessarily call into question certain behaviors and certain things that shape our behavior. So culture is therefore an active process of compliance, resistance, and creativity. So we have this notion that when we have a meaning made, for example, how we make sense of our life, um, that meaning can then therefore shape our behavior. But we can also, accept or reject that meaning. So when I talk about an active process, it's often that we accept this meaning in various ways, but we can also reject part of it. And therein lies the negotiation in a sort of creative process. One example of a creative process of cultural acceptance or cultural rejection is a very relevant topic, especially for this project and also in the context of War Child Holland. We have the material and also discursive destruction of the Ukrainian culture, nation state, etc., through the invasion of Russia, the invasion perpetrated by Russia, rather. And if you can see on the screen, it says culture is a dedicated target in the Russian war strategy. So it's not just material destruction, but also cultural genocide. And if we have this notion of culture as a way of life, we can think of the way that these Ukrainian ballet dancers who are displaced in France practice this active process of rejection of this cultural imposition of destruction, right? And so this is just one example of how we can either accept, reject, or negotiate very real and very material cultural forces. So culture as a way of life um, means that social structures and institutions use culture as a system of regulation. This means that social structures and institutions are very much a part of how we go through the meaning-making process and are very much shaping, again, our behavior, but once again, not determining it. Social as a way of life integrates individuals into a specific socioeconomic system, meaning that the socioeconomic system at hand in which we find ourselves is very much guided by cultural institutions. And culture as a way of life represents prevailing ideas as natural, quote unquote natural, and quote unquote common sense, right? So if we think of culture as a way of life, this means that the ideas that we find natural and common sense may actually just be a result of this sort of this cultural shaping and these notions of culture as kind of a guiding principle. And finally, culture as a way of life silences and disciplines some members over others. And this brings in the notion of power, which I will discuss a little bit later. But essentially, culture as a way of life silencing means that certain voices are privileged over others. And this disciplining is very much reliant on the Foucauldian notion of discipline and power, which means that, for example, certain institutions really provide voice and advocacy for some groups, very sort of powerful groups, but then marginalize others. So to provide an example, this is some work that colleagues at the university that I attended in India are doing right now with the marginalized children of laborers that work on the campus of the university. It's called Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, and these laborers provide massive amounts of labor, of sweat, toil, blood, and tears, and their children are often not allowed to, for example, attend even primary school, often secondary school. And so this group, this unnoticed group, what they call themselves, they provide advocacy, provide resources for these silenced and disciplined members of the Indian society, right? So very specifically, we have notions of class, notions of caste, notions of colorism, all wrapped up into one that are obviously undergirded by cultural values and cultural ideologies that work to silence certain groups, certain members of society. And so I just wanted to highlight this advocacy as kind of another way that we can, again, accept certain notions that are communicated by culture and then reject others, right? We can reject notions of unfairness. We can accept notions of empowerment, that kind of thing. Culture as a way of life shapes our interests and motives, but also importantly, it is shaped by our interests and motives. So as individuals, we can also contribute to the system. And that is something that I think both the Mental Health for All project and the work at War Child is doing, right? So it's shaped by interests. It's shaped by, for example, notions of humanitarianism, notions of the public good, notions of safety and security, but then also there is a feedback loop between actors, right? So we have this notion that I am interested in, for example, advocacy and providing voice and letting folks speak for themselves, and this can then sort of feed into a notion of empowerment and maybe even social justice. Culture as a way of life is affected by also notions of gender, class, sexuality, race, ethnicity, etc., right? So also notions of ability status, notions of neurodiversity, notions of class, notions of caste. Um, all of these things are culturally specific and contextually relevant, right? So for example, gender is performed in different ways across the world. So we have different notions of what gender is supposed to look like, what men are supposed to do, what women are supposed to do, etc. And of course, the salient categories are also very prevalent in certain ways and not as prevalent in other ways. So for example, the notion of race, which is something that I've done a lot of research on, is not as commonly discussed in the European context, whereas in the United States context, race occupies a more sort of prevalent position. And so we kind of have to think about different contexts and different contextual cues when we discuss, for example, notions of cultural diversity. Gender, class, sexuality, race, ethnicity, other ways of being different, caste, class, all of those, they really have to take a contextual spin. And then these notions also, when we think of culture as a way of life, define how we are positioned within a system, right? So culture, this notion of culture as a way of life really positions us in various hierarchies that are overlapping and under sort of girding our position in a socioeconomic system, an institutional system, or a cultural system. Right, so we have this notion that culture as a way of life really puts us into a specific place, and from that place we can then sort of move through life, make sense of the world, as it were. So how does this relate to mental health? I'll give you a minute to think about it. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So here we have this notion of culture sensitive versus culture centered from Mohan Dutta, who is a health communication scholar who does amazing work in advocacy in sort of, providing healthcare interventions for various folks across the world. A lot of his research is done in rural contexts. And so he came up with this distinction between culture sensitive and culture centered. Now, culture sensitive thinks of culture as a static collection of shared values, beliefs, and practices that are contained within a clearly defined community. So this is a notion of culture that really relies on a cultural essence. There's a culture, there's an essence, there's a culture that can be defined by boundaries and that is very clearly defined. Whereas a culture-centered approach acknowledges that culture is a complex and dynamic web of meanings that are in flux and interact with economic, social, and political structures. So the difference between these two conceptualizations of culture means that on the one hand, we have a static belief of culture, right? This essential belief of culture. And on the other hand, we have a sort of multifaceted or, sort of complicated notion of culture. Now, in the culture-sensitive approach, the focus is on identifying patterns and categorizing target cultures to predict behaviors, design best practices, programs, or campaigns. And this has been practiced in a lot of non-governmental organization interventions, healthcare interventions, etc., where one seeks to go into a field, identify patterns, do research, for example, and then really categorize the target cultures and think of how best to help them, right? This is one way of thinking of providing a culture-sensitive approach. However, in the culture-centered approach, the focus is on identifying disempowered groups and listening to how the marginalized define their problems and construct their own needs. So do we hear a difference there? On the one hand, we have experts going into a field and defining a culture and their problems, whereas on the culture-centered side of things, we have the notion of defining a culture on their own terms and really thinking about how their needs are best communicated and making sure that, for example, they are considered the experts. Right? So on the one hand, culture-sensitive approaches really mean that external experts define the needs of a community, and this critique has been leveled against, for example, NGOs working in rural, sort of quote-unquote, lesser developed nations where people will go into a context and not necessarily understand the culture or not necessarily be able to kind of grasp all of the nuances, therefore leading to less effective interventions. And within the culture-centered approach, rather, structural inequities come to the fore, meaning that we have a very nuanced view of what power constitutes and how power manifests in a cultural context, and importantly, that communities are the experts, right? So we put the expertise, we allow for communities to speak for themselves and really allow for this advocacy to take place, right? So this is the culture-centered approach. And this is that distinction between culture-sensitive and culture-centered. So now we've reached the part of the presentation where I'd like to describe the Mental Health for All project. Let me show you a short video.
Mental health problems affect about 84 million people across the EU. Refugees and other migrants who do not speak the language of their host country face a lack of access to mental health care services. The Mental Health for All project builds a multilingual digital platform to overcome language barriers in mental health care, promoting mental health and increasing quality of life for all.
So the Mental Health for All project is done in collaboration with 9 countries, coordinated by the University of Amsterdam and situated within the Amsterdam School of Communication Research. It is also done in collaboration with the Center for Urban Mental Health, which is also based here in Amsterdam. Here you can see the list of our partner organizations. The Mental Health for All project consists of 6 sub-projects, our work packages. The first work package is management coordination of the action, meaning the logistical and organizational concerns. I am predominantly responsible for this within my capacity as a postdoc at the University of Amsterdam. And the second and third work packages are quite exciting, particularly right now, because they are running at the moment. So I'm going to talk about those in greater detail. The fourth and fifth work packages are based on the notion of patient educational narratives. So what we're going to do is we're collecting data in order to create educational videos for healthcare providers. And then finally, the sixth work package is an evaluation of the aforementioned digital multilingual platform. But I'm going to go deeper in depth on the second and third work packages, which are mapping existing language resources in mental health care and then identifying barriers, needs, and communication strategies. Work Package 2, Mapping Language Resources in Mental Health Care, is coordinated by the partner institution at the Universidad de Alcalá in Spain. One of the outputs of this project is a resource for healthcare providers and seekers that will be included in the open access digital platform to enhance knowledge about how to access language support for use in mental health care services. So what we've done as a consortium is each country has identified language resources, for example, brochures, websites, translation services, and compiled a database of resources that are accessible to those seeking access to mental health care. And what we're going to do is we're going to put those resources in the hands of those seeking mental health by providing an open access digital platform. This is one of the main outputs of this sub-project. An additional output is that we are providing an assessment grid for the evaluation of resources, meaning we're going to look at the quality and also the scope of these resources, and it's going to kind of improve the quality of how we go about these processes to seek mental health care. And then finally, Work Package 2 is providing a report about the language resources and their usefulness. So the real aim of Work Package 2 is to provide this notion of advocacy to those seeking mental health care, specifically refugees and migrants who have a low level of language capacities.